Hello, good evening, everybody. I think we can already start. I just saw that also our last speaker just joined a couple of seconds ago, so welcome to you as well. Let me introduce you shortly. My name is Stephanie Fenkart. I'm the director of the International Institute for Peace, and today I'm moderating instead of my friend, my colleague Marilla Husch, who unfortunately got sick. But nevertheless, I look forward to the next 1 hour, 15 minutes. On our today already fifth and also last part of the series, which we call Odesa Talks, at least for the summer break, and I'm happy that we were able to hold these talks again together with many partners we used to organize, especially with the Center of International European Studies of the Kadir University in Istanbul, a symposium called International Neighborhood Symposium, which took place in Istanbul, and then due to the security situation, it was moved to Odesa. Then COVID came, so we couldn't hold it there. And then, of course, now the war started. So again, there is no possibility to hold it in person, which is why we actually tried to move it online so that it doesn't vanish, because it was always a very nice project with many different partners. I already mentioned the Kadir University. There's also Ukraine Analytica, which is based in Odesa, the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism in Kyiv, the NGO Quadrivium, the Black Sea Trust Fund, and others. So this is just for a very, very short break. And just to give you a short summary of what we already did. And today we would like to talk about the European security architecture and Russia. I think it is, of course, a very, very timely topic, as all the topics we had previously dealing with the regional context, with the civil society, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its consequences generally, the European Union and its neighborhood. I mean, all those issues were in the previous ones. And today we try to tackle the European security architecture and Russia. I'm very happy to have 4 excellent speakers who will in a second start with their initial remarks. But of course, we also do have other participants, and please feel free to pose questions already during the talk, and I will go through it while we are speaking, and we'll post them to the specific persons in case it is addressed to a specific person. I would like to start with Daria Isachenko. She's an associate at the Center for Applied Turkish Studies at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. Thank you very much for your time. Daria, your research interests are especially Turkey-Russia relations, Turkey and regional cooperation and alliances in Eurasia, regional and interstate conflicts. And when we now look at Turkey, because on the one hand, we see it as actually a very strong NATO partner, and on the other hand, we can see it has a very divergent interests to the other Western allies, for example, in Syria, where it then also has specific ties when it comes to Russia. I mean, different interests than the European Union, for example. And then there is, of course, NATO, which is very confrontational, or the other way around when it comes to Russia. And then there is Turkey. Very interesting, and I think it came to a surprise to many of us after the Russian war, which it launched in February 24th in Ukraine. Turkey quite quickly became some kind of a spot for the first talks, mediation on a possible, let's call it really possible peace negotiation. So this is, I think, was very, very striking for many Europeans also to see that this is something which many did not see coming. Maybe you can just explain a little bit the difficult relationship between Turkey and Russia, and then especially also what is actually Turkey's main interest when it comes also to the whole European security architecture when it is confrontational, for example, now with the Russian Federation. So thanks for joining for around 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for organizing this talks and also for your kind invitation. Well, about Turkey and Russia, I think this, as you already also mentioned, the relationship between Turkey and Russia is as much complicated as Turkey's relations with Ankara's Western partners, and this already kind of partly explains Turkey-Russia partnership. I mean, when we look at it at this current stage, it is, of course, tempting to explain it with the personal chemistry between the current presidents, although I think we should look to really understand how this partnership emerged and how it has been evolving, we should really look at the years 2015, 2016, because I think Syria was very much central, has played a central role in this relationship. And I think there also been some lessons that both Putin and Erdogan have taken from this fighter jet crisis in November 2015, when Turkish air forces shot down Russian fighter jet. And I think the main lesson for Putin back then was Turkish strategic orientation, that it's actually a Western one. So if we trace what he has said about this incident, he talked about step in the back and many various things. But then in December 2015, he actually said what upset him most was the fact that Erdogan did not call Putin directly, but turned to Brussels instead. I think since then, the Russian leadership does not make any kind of illusion that the Turkish anchoring in the security political sphere is in the West. I mean, Turkey is a NATO member, and this has never been questioned inside Russia. But I think what they make use of is really the divergence of interests. And I also think that it's in Syria. We see how, for example, why is it that this personal chemistry between Putin and Erdogan did not help them to mitigate the crisis, but we've seen this unprecedented breakup of relationship in this. So I think it really shows that the divergence or convergence of interest plays a more central role rather than the political leadership in these countries. And I think what Erdogan learned was really this economic dependency on Russia, and in specifically that the exit costs of this relationship are higher for Turkey than for Russia. Having said that, I would not really characterize this relationship as an asymmetric one, that Turkey depends more on Russia than Russia depends more on Turkey, because Turkey has also played a key role for Russia to establish Astana process in Syria. So I wouldn't really tend to measure this relationship in mere numbers, especially given the fact that, for example, as far as energy is concerned, Turkey has been successful to diversify its energy supplies. So this just to perhaps to briefly end up these initial statements, we see that it's really like Turkey and Russia, either they are in cooperation or they are in conflict, as it was 2015, 2016. And what brought them together was also not only the convergence of interests, but also the fact that the Russian leadership has always expressed this kind of understanding of Turkish interests, but also not only understanding, but actually addressing them. And I think this part, what we now see the limits of this part, that like that the Ankara's Western allies have not been that keen to address interests of Turkey. So if we talk about also balancing of Turkey between Russia and the West, I think perhaps it would be, how to say, a more nuanced picture to say that Turkey is balancing its security threats rather than between Russia and the West, because the fact is that the Black Sea now is not the only security concern of Turkey, which is why you would not expect the same kind of policy from Turkey as, say, from Spain or Denmark, because geography simply matters, and Russia does not pose the same kind of security concern, because like Turkey now faces a diversity of security concerns in the neighborhood, and in some areas it's has to cooperate with Russia. In other areas, the West will be the central part, but I'm sure Serhat will tell more about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daria. I think you already mentioned many things to which Serhat could probably also add a little bit. But first, I would like also to welcome him and present him. Serhat Güvenç, sorry if I don't really say it correctly, is Professor of International Relations at the Kadir University in Istanbul. As far as I know, you're also the chair of the Department of International Relations at the Kadir University. So thank you very much also for joining, and maybe on what Daria has just been saying. I mean, the role of Turkey in this whole European, let's call it, conflict between the West and Russia, or between also Ukraine and Russia, or NATO and Russia. We just had I would say a major change just last week at the European Council, when the European Council decided to grant candidate status, for example, to Moldova and Ukraine. And we all know that Turkey is on this path since 2005. So we're talking around now. I mean, it was on the path until it was frozen, of course, for different reasons. So just my question to you would be, like, where is Turkey heading, like, in a long-term view? I mean, what is the geopolitical ambition of Turkey? Since we in Western Europe, we always tend only to look at our immediate neighborhood, which is in the south and of course also in the east and in the southeast. But this, I'm assuming, is very, very different than for Turkey. And then also it was also mentioned that it is a very important NATO member as well, but now it is also blocking the accession, or it is trying to block the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO. So a very, very interesting and also concerning, I would say, development, which we know from new enlargement processes in the Western Balkans. So my question to you, long-term perspective, geopolitical implications, Turkey for European security, and you're welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a long, list of questions to address. But let me pick up where Daria has left off as regards to Turkey's threat perceptions. I mean, Daria very accurately pointed out that Russia is one of Turkey's security concerns, but it's not top security concern for Turkey at the moment. Therefore, we don't see a perfect fit or convergence of threat perceptions between Turkey and Turkey's Western allies, or the other members of the so-called Western security community. The current situation in Ukraine indeed caught Turkey sort of off guard, because Ankara had its all attention and efforts focused on the south, the unfolding situation in Syria, and which remains, I think, top priority for Turkey. And Turkey's blocking of Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO on a fast track is a perfect manifestation of that security concern. The established linkage between the two issues, the PKK's offshoot in Syria and Swedish membership in particular, it mirrors that priority of that security concern for Turkey. But this doesn't mean that Turkey and Russia are not rivals or competitors. Indeed, the essence of the relationship is competition, not cooperation. But they have a long history of dealing with each other, and they have a long history of managing that competition. What they exercise is competition management. Just to give you, in order to support my argument, let me give you the example of the Turkish, the highly advertised Turkish cross-border operation into Syria, which has not materialized as yet. Well, obviously, Kremlin was not so keen to give Turkey a blank check to go ahead and expand its areas under its military control in Syria in exchange of, Turkish understanding and Turkish cooperation with Russia, especially in the context of NATO-related affairs. I think it was Lavrov himself. He said, holding Finnish and Swedish memberships, does not justify Russian approval of a Turkish cross-border operation into Syria. And I think this will play some role in changing Turkey's minds as regards to NATO's upcoming and probably inevitable expansion towards Nordic countries. Okay, so Turkey's move, although it was not mainly motivated to appease Russia, I mean, as a byproduct, as an intended consequence, it could help reduce Russia's opposition to Turkey's military activism in Syria, but it didn't work that way. So probably, I mean, Russia will be less of a consideration for Turkey when ultimately deciding whether or not green light the admission of these two countries to Russia. As for EU membership, you know, granting candidacy status, well, many of us have given up on Turkey's EU membership. As you pointed out, you know, accession negotiations started in 2005 and they quickly ran out of steam. And I don't even remember when was the last time a chapter was opened for negotiations. So, so there is two explanations for lack of a significant Turkish reaction to this decision to quickly grant those status to those countries. Well, first, lack of interest, lack of appeal of EU membership or the promise of EU membership. And secondly, probably, and this one is based on the peculiar, unique Turkish experience, is that, you know, candidate status does not necessarily mean that, you know, those countries will ultimately join the EU. So therefore, there is a significant less of enthusiasm, excitement, and seriousness as regards to this issue. And my final note will be on how Turkey and Europe were so unprepared to realize how significant Turkey and NATO would be for the future of European security. Because the Russian invasion of Ukraine indeed brought an old institution, you know, NATO, back on the spotlight, and neither Brussels nor Ankara was ready to deal with each other on equal terms since 1999. You know, Brussels was the party that was lecturing Turkey as regards to homeworks, you know, things to do at home and in foreign policy. And Ankara, you know, was the decision taker, decision receiver as regards to the things it had to do to cover, to meet the famous criteria. But now, I mean, we have members of European Union and Turkey on a level plane. And this is not a situation they're not used to be. You know, I mean, you know, it's that asymmetry in that relationship is gone. And yes, Turkey has an important role to play for European security, but after decades of exclusion and after decades of disillusion, there is a visible lack of enthusiasm on the part of Turkish decision makers and public to assume a substantial role or to become a substantial contributor to the European security, particularly when Russia is not perceived as an existential threat, unlike many East European and Nordic countries of Europe. Therefore, until Russia assumes a more aggressive posture towards Ankara, probably Ankara will be sitting on the fence. Okay, so trying to keep this act of balancing in its relations with Russia and NATO without prejudicing its status and its position in NATO. So as a long-time and staunch ally of NATO, it will continue to contribute to NATO's military functions. For instance, as we speak, Turkish Air Force is contributing with 5 or 6 F-16s to Baltops exercise in the north. So that shows how seriously Turkey takes its military obligations towards NATO. But when it comes to politics or Turkey's geopolitical future, it's a different story. But nevertheless, the accumulated result of all these small crises between Turkey and the West may indeed hasten Turkey's shift of axis away from the West. That we have to keep in mind as a possibility, because when I look at the sequence of past events, I mean, I cannot find any reason to be optimistic as regards to both sides' intentions and ability to redefine their relationship in a better way. What we are experiencing, what we are witnessing is the consequences of decades of accumulated grudge, mistrust, and maybe dishonesty on both sides. Therefore, unless the relationship is redefined based on mutual trust and honesty, I'm afraid there are more crises, Turkey-induced crisis in the transatlantic community in the coming years, months, and probably weeks. And the status of Turkish Straits may eventually play a very important role in precipitating a final crisis of confidence between Turkey and the West. That's all I would like to say at this point.
Thank you very much, Serhat. I think you mentioned also very interesting things, and it was very good adding up to what Daria already explained. But it's what I got is that Russia is a security concern, but definitely not the strongest one for Russia, and also that this decades of illusions towards the European Union, or this reciprocal disillusion of each other, might lead to further, I would say, disentanglement between the two. And I think this is something we would need to look upon even further. Let's now move to Mykola Kapitonenko. He's an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University. He's already also an advisory board member of the International Institute for Peace. And I would say that especially from your position, Mykola, it is very, very different, that Russia definitely is an existential threat, not only for the West, but for Ukraine as a whole, as a country. So now, what would you say? How important was the Council resolution last week to grant the candidate status? Does this mean that Ukrainians are prepared to close the NATO membership door for now, at least, or for the next five years? And how do you cope with the long-term security situation, the role of Ukraine and Russia for European security? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for now the candidate status of Ukraine? And how do you assess also what is, maybe you also know that this whole energy situation in Western and Central Europe has become a very, very big and important topic. So, and we can see already new dividing lines between more the Eastern countries and the Western countries, with all this inflation and the energy supply, gas stops, etc. So it's going to be very, very difficult for Ukraine to keep their issue high on the European agenda, I see. And so what would you say? What is the long-term implication for European security in this context? And I'm glad to see you again.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will try to address all the questions, but probably will not be able to. And I will approach the issue of EU candidacy, which was the hot topic during the last days here in Ukraine, from a little bit different perspective from the security point of view. Starting with pointing out that I think that what happened on February 24th was the invasion of Russia into Ukraine has demonstrated clearly how vulnerable European security has been in 8 years before that. And that's actually what we have been paying attention to, meaning that the protracted conflict, low-intensity military conflict, which has been going on between Russia and Ukraine since 2014, was a major threat. And Europe was not only unable to prevent it in a way, but it also was unable to manage it. And in order to draw any lessons from that, we have to address the question of why Minsk process, which was the key, the core element of European security between 2014 and 2022, has failed. Many of the answers to the questions about how European security will look in the future are linked to the questions of how Europe was unable to manage this huge and very dangerous crisis. I'm sure that this war should not have been taking place. This is something which brings about a host of risks and mostly negative consequences for all participants, certainly for Ukraine, but also for Russia and for Europe. And Europe, in the long run, continues to lose its geopolitical potential and significance. And what is often missing in this war is its global dimension, when it may be said that this is kind of event which may shift the international order, and this may be seen as the war against the previous world order, the Western based, or the world order which has been dominated by the Western approaches. And if seen from that perspective, it is not only about Russia, certainly. It is also about the global South, it is about China, it is about power transition theory, and it is about the limits of the strengths and the West has. And we can, after 4 months of the war, we can see whether the West is capable of delivering political results, whether instruments which are being applied by the West, sanctions, pressure, military and financial aid to Ukraine, threats, whether they actually work. And this is also one of the reasons for which I believe that this war is going to last for quite long, because it is not only about exhausting how quickly Russia will get exhausted, or Ukraine, and they will probably reach some kind of compromise. This is a bigger issue. I guess that EU candidacy for Ukraine within this context was an important step, but I also think that I have a theory that this war is speeding up the processes which have been existing before in what concerns motivations and interests of major parties, and also major controversies between them. And Russia was willing to addressing the issue of what Russia really wants. I think that Russia was willing to weaken Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine will not become a part of the West and will not pose any serious threat to Russia in the years to come. That was Russia was doing between 2014 and 2022, and that is what it is continued to do today, but with other means. In the same way, the West, it certainly is not something united, because there are different nuances and different groups of interests. And for instance, the difference between the American approach and the European approach is apparent, but also there are differences inside the European Union, also in non-European Union countries like the United Kingdom. But generally, it may be said that the West was looking for a response which would not allow Ukraine to fail on the one hand, but on the other hand would not drag the West too deep into this conflict by betting its reputation, financial costs, resources, and generally political potential. And I think that this is a dilemma which still faces the Western countries and European countries in particular. And the difference was that the events of 2022 has significantly changed the landscape, the political landscape, and made some absolutely fantastic decisions several weeks or months before the invasion, quite realistic. And no one could have thought that Ukraine will be able to get a candidacy status in the European Union half a year ago. But with the Russian invasion, some foundations of European security architecture have been shaken. And because of that, some absolutely new opportunities have been opening. And I was talking and writing that the key to the resolution of this conflict is the security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot get them from Russia because no one would trust Russia. So we will need some additional effective security guarantees, which can be provided by not so many alternatives, either directly by the United States, for instance, with NATO membership, which was absolutely unrealistic, or by EU membership, which was also quite unlikely, but looked like a little bit more realistic than NATO membership. And dropping of NATO membership aspirations could also have become a part of the deal with Russia, because Russia was stressing that NATO membership for Ukraine is unacceptable, and in particular, it was one of the reasons of the invasion. So my idea was that granting Ukraine a clear European perspective would have been the first step towards the resolution of the whole conflict, addressing the most important issue. So Ukraine has been trying to get that, and obviously it became clear that it is quite difficult from a technical perspective, and getting in membership is also politically difficult because many countries in the EU would have been against it. So I see that candidacy status as a compromise, as a step which enables Europe, and in particular Paris and Berlin, Germany and France being responsible for European security and for its future and for all the problems Europe will face in the years to come. It enables them to save time, to see how this war actually ends, because no one knows today. The war is always a crisis and a high level of unpredictability. So anyway, we have to wait and see who wins. And a candidacy status thus is a half step towards finding any way of resolving this conflict, or an effort to do that. I do understand that this is something quite different from membership. It provides Ukraine with some instruments, in particular financial instruments, but this is not something which can change the situation which we're facing today on the battlefield. So this is probably a face-saving option for the Europeans, but it is better than nothing. But I don't think that it is going to have a dramatic impact on how the war is evolving. NATO membership issue, there have been signals for quite a long period of time that Ukraine is ready to drop it because it is unrealistic. And it recently has been stressed once again by one of the Ukrainian officials. And I also think that NATO is transforming. I do think that the EU, which granted Ukraine the candidacy status several days ago, is quite different from the EU, which accepted the countries of Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 21st century. And Europe today is quite different from what it used to be 20 years ago. The same is true about NATO. Since this war is a huge crisis which will redefine the foundations of the European security, it will also affect the efficiency of NATO and actually how it operates. And I do think that the credibility of NATO, at least in Ukraine, is to a certain extent undermined, and they believe that Ukraine will one day join NATO and get all its problems resolved is also quite weak in Ukraine. And finally, to the split in public opinion in Europe concerning all the problems you have mentioned with energy, with growing problems with the economy, inflation, and all this cost of war, which Europe has to face because it was unable to prevent the conflict. And I think that it will have to face all these issues later also. And this is only part of the price Europe is paying today. But I think that naturally it generates different concerns among Europeans, different division lines. I don't think that they follow the boundaries between states, and in particular between Western and Eastern Europe. Although I do understand that Western Europeans may have a different security agenda from that of Eastern Europeans. But I also think that this division lights are running inside European societies, because there are different groups and different people in different European countries who take different approaches to Russia, to the future of European security, to assisting Ukraine, and to issues like those. We have to, not only Ukrainians have to deal with it, to learn to how to deal with it, but also Europeans have to understand the political future, because the political debates are going to evolve around these issues. And I don't think that that will be easy. And as before 2022, Europe still needs a strategy, which is lacking towards Russia. The lack of strategy probably partly is responsible for what has happened in both in 2014 and 2022. But now it is a matter of a strategic significance for Europe. Defining what to do with Russia, understanding Russia's motives and interests, and understanding Europe's own strengths and weaknesses is critically important.
Thank you so much, Mykola. You already gave me a very good line, I would say, which I then also will give forward to our last speaker, who is Pavel Baev. He's a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo called PRIO. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, and your research is mostly on Russian military reform, but also energy and foreign interests of Russia in foreign policies. So maybe, first of all, welcome. And maybe after what Mykola just said, I mean, he was speaking about the vulnerability of European security. The European Union and the West was not prepared to manage this conflict, which is not now, of course. I mean, the war started now, but I mean, the first war already started in 2014. And he also mentioned, which I think is very, very important, it does have, I mean, this war does have negative consequences for all. This is including Russia. It's including also the West. It might even be NATO, even though it doesn't really look like it right now. However, Mykola also mentioned that NATO might be transforming right now. And we all know that nowadays, I mean, today it starts in Madrid, the NATO summit. And we just recently, I think yesterday or the day before, we heard that NATO is boosting its high alert force from 40,000 up to 300,000 troops, which is like, I would say, like a huge amount more than before. And we do speak, especially since February, we speak even more about the so-called Cold War between the West and Russia. And this is also very much, not only, but it is one of the Russian narratives as well, like saying that NATO has been expanding all the time. And of course, it's also the Ukrainians and this whole very, very dull Nazification argument. But for Russia, they always like pose in the end. I mean, they say it's a NATO enlargement. So my question would be like, maybe you can give us a brief overview about this NATO-Russian relationships. We all know we had this huge hope of integrating Russia into European security, like coming from this idea that Russia is situated in Europe, so it needs to be part anyway of European security, be it in a defense alliance like NATO is. Could there be something like more dealing with collective security mechanisms? And if we look right now, I mean, it seems ever far away. So, I mean, what can we expect now from this summit? I mean, of course, this 300,000 high alert force troops will be a topic. But of course, and this is also what Mykola said, that the European Union and the West never really understood how to deal with Russia. And I mean, this might also be part of what probably in the summit also might come up. But I'll let you talk now. And thank you very much for joining.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, I am very glad to be a part of this discussion, and not only because the topic is very important, but also because the word Odesa for me means so much, as for every Russian, unfortunately also for Vladimir Putin. But I hope very much to be able to visit again this wonderful city in the near future. In the next couple of days, unfortunately, it will be probably mentioned more than once in Madrid during the NATO discussions. It is one of the focal points of confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and NATO. And as a matter of short reflection, let me say that I am old enough to remember that moment in the year 1990. I was in London when NATO adopted a declaration on which was a kind of historical document saying it's a new era in Europe, confrontation is over. We extend the hand of cooperation to Russia. And now I feel like it's going to full circle, 32 years, and NATO again is gathering with a very different agenda. But it's not really a replay. The security architecture is too different. And I understand this word, security architecture, not as a structure or as an institution or a set of rules, but as a process. And the process is definitely now going very fast and is extremely distorted by the major conventional war in the heart of Europe. So this war itself makes the NATO discussions and the immediate tasks for topics for these discussions, the immediate tasks for the alliance, very clear. There is no conceptual model how to deal with Russia. The task is very clear: how to ensure that Russian aggression doesn't succeed, how to make sure Ukraine wins. It is a definition of this victory which is really hard to give. And it is a topic for many intellectual discussion, academic debates, and political quarrels. And overall, I would argue that the minimalist definition of this victory for Ukraine is the return to status quo ante to February 23. Withdrawal of Russian troops to where they were before the invasion. It's not an optimal solution. Many in Ukraine would disagree and insist on more, while many others would say it's going too far. I think the goal is feasible. I think the battles, hard as they are, generally point in that direction, because our Russian army is getting more and more exhausted and more ancient, more and more demodernized, returning to the Soviet patterns and the Soviet arms system. Ukrainian army is getting many ways stronger, better equipped, more modern. So I think this victory is possible, not probably within next weeks, but I think President Zelensky is right arguing that it is possible to achieve that within this year. It is a hard task, but I think in NATO there is a lot of readiness to make sure that Ukraine is able to sustain its effort to sustain its fight. What this minimalist definition of victory would mean, and I would say three different things. One is that Ukraine becomes a major pillar of European security architecture. And again, pillar is not a structure, it's again a process. Ukraine is able to rebuild its economy, to restore its armed forces, to regain a lot of confidence, to utilize a lot of Western aid and goodwill, to go in very fast with reforms which are necessary and were stalled for so long. It is about Ukraine, first thing. The second thing is about Russia. Russian military machine in this war will be degraded and weakened very considerably. When U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin mentioned that point, weakening Russia, he got a lot of criticism, but essentially it's not really an aim or a goal. It is what is happening. It's a fact of life. And if this minimalist victory happens, it means Russian armed forces will be very severely degraded. And NATO will be in a position of strength in many ways. Certainly 300,000 you mentioned is just a figure. There is no plan for strengthening numerically armed forces in many NATO states. And the United States may bring additional brigade into Europe, which doesn't mean that the military presence will increase 10 times. But nevertheless, NATO position of strength will be there. Many NATO states will be much safer and secure than they ever were, particularly the Baltic states. It will be a different configuration. And the third thing probably is minimalist victory will mean is that Putin's regime will not be able to survive it. I am much more confident in my first two propositions than in this one, but there is so much invested personally from Mr. Putin into this war that I don't think this minimalist victory, which is a significant defeat, will let him stay in power. We will see a lot of internal struggle, who will succeed in what configuration. will hardly see any nice persons kind of taking power after Putin. It will be essentially the same elites, very dirty and very corrupt, very properly sanctioned, but nevertheless very eager to move forward, to put the blame on Putin, to say it's all his fault. We need to find a way forward. And the way forward means the second stage of victory for Ukraine, where it will be possible to negotiate with this Putin's successors the full withdrawal of Russian troops, first from Donbass, negotiate with them reparations for the damage done. That will be kind of the second phase of this process, which is not that far away probably, and for which NATO needs to prepare. It's much easier in Madrid to discuss strengthening of forward defense and confronting Russia than the next stage. But I can remind you that after the historical London Declaration in 1990, Soviet Union fell apart in a year and a half. It wasn't possible to foresee it at then. But again, NATO needs now to think about the consequences of the defeat for Russia and prepare for the risks and opportunities that will come out of that. I am not predicting that Russia will fall apart, but I am predicting that this defeat will trigger also the complex domestic crisis through which Russia will be going for a long time. And during that process, it will be important to engage Russia in many ways, and NATO will be in a position to do that. I don't think we can entrust this process to Messieurs Macron and Scholz, and Biden, if he stays in power, will be too busy with his domestic agendas. I think NATO will play an essential role, and it will be able to look at the track record of its relations with the Soviet Union and Russia to learn from its own mistakes and from its achievements. There were many of those. So I think engaging Russia will be a key task, not in the immediate future, but probably as soon as a couple of years from now. And I will stop here in order to leave more time for discussion.
Thank you very much. And here also to our guests again, please pose your questions if you have any. And in the meantime, I would still like to give the floor maybe also to Daria, because you were the first speaker, and afterwards, I mean, so many people are speaking and come up with new things you might have a comment on it. And also what comes to my mind is when we talk about now, I mean, today, about European security, we do speak a lot about NATO and like this typical hard security, when before we actually talked so much about migration, about terror attacks, about climate crisis. So the whole discussion really shifted again towards this hard security, about weapons and weapons for peace, etc. But Daria, what would you like maybe to add to the discussion so far, because you were the first speaker?
Yeah, well, I forgot to mention on your in your initial statements you mentioned about this that Turkey caught many by surprise by its effort to mediate in the conflict. So I perhaps a comment on that. Actually, Erdogan was, to my knowledge, actually the first one to call for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And it was back in November when there were only like tensions have risen, but still no war in sight. So I think, and now Turkey is also very much active to negotiate this route to export grains from Ukraine. And back in February and still now, I, for example, ask myself a question, why there is no cooperation between Turkey and, for example, EU member states. So, for example, there have been, as far as grain is concerned, there are now several plans circulating. I know France is interested to do it via Romania, but it's by land. I think Germany was also involved, has engaged to facilitate grain export via Poland. And I think the most visible again was Turkey, that also has elaborated a plan together with Russia. But I still, I think by sea is perhaps would be the easiest way, if I'm not mistaken, to facilitate the export of grain. So actually, I don't really have that much of a comment, but many questions as to why there is not that much cooperation between Turkey and EU member states on this export of grain question. So perhaps Mykola or Pavel or Serhat might want to comment on that.
I very happily forward this question to Serhat, maybe first.
Well, I have been trying to stay on top of what has been debated as regards to providing an access for Ukraine's grain exports to the rest of the world in particular. And the debate has evolved in diametrically opposed directions in Turkey and in Europe in particular. I mean, especially in Britain, there are very hawkish opinions and options discussed, whereas Turkey is working on a scheme that would involve Russia's blessing, if not approval, to make that possible. But my honest opinion is that it's very difficult. I mean, Russia will never give consent on Ukraine's grain exports to the world through the port of Odesa or through the remaining Black Sea, Ukrainian Black Sea ports. But nevertheless, I mean, Turkey is working really hard, trying to keep Russia in the loop, but I think it's almost mission impossible. Today, indeed, I watched an interview by a retired British general. He sees the only realistic option as NATO's full involvement, full commitment to the protection of merchant vessels, grain carriers that would be taking the grain out of Ukraine and through the Turkish straits. But this option would definitely trigger a Russian reaction and is most likely to bring or escalate into a major confrontation between NATO and Russia. So I guess we will see a lot more and more rounds of debate on this issue, but the window of opportunity is very fast narrowing. I mean, within a couple of months, that, you know, whatever stockpile of grain Ukraine might have will no longer be exportable or consumable, and this will mean the end of discussion. So my hunch is that, you know, Ankara is trying to keep the NATO option off the table because of the risk of escalation to a full-scale war involving NATO and Russia. And in that case, Turkey will have no choice but to either side with Russia or NATO, and Ankara is trying to avoid that. And indeed, in the Black Sea, Turkey is in a very difficult position, difficult situation. The straits have been close to the warships of the belligerents, but Turkey has asked others unofficially not to send in warships to the Black Sea. So there is a de facto, indeed, ban on non-littorals warships transit through the Turkish straits. And that position is not sustainable, I mean, honestly, because about 2 months ago, NATO Marcom commander, a British general, said, you know, NATO does not intend to stay out of Black Sea for long. So again, the time for making tough decisions, difficult decisions, fast approaching for Turkey. And with the prolongation of the war in Ukraine, Turkey is running out of options. You know, there is little room left for Turkey to, you know, muddle through, you know, to play as a mediator or facilitator, etc. So by the end of this summer, we will have a better understanding of where Turkey will stand in the future European security architecture?
Thank you very much. Mykola, would you like to add something? Maybe also a little bit on in general, the Ukraine position towards also what Turkey is doing and how they also part of, I mean, they, even though they are not in general friendly towards Russia, but they do have their, even though in the competition, some parts of cooperation due to their other security concerns. I mean, is this also a topic within Ukraine in general, or is really the focus totally on the West and leaving out what is happening there, considering that there were these meetings in Istanbul or in Ankara, I think, about negotiations, about getting to somehow humanitarian corridors, at least, even though in the West, I mean, many had the feeling that nobody actually went there with the right intentions actually to gain something. I mean, what would you say to this Turkey, Ukraine, Russia?
Certainly, Ukrainians are focusing on relations with Turkey, not only on relations with the West. And during Zelensky's presidency, Turkey has become really one of our key strategic partners. His most recent visits have been to Turkey and also vice versa. So contacts with Turkey have been extremely important and active during recent 3 years. And those Ukrainians who are realistic, they do understand that the breadth of agenda of the Turkish foreign policy, and they do understand that Turkey is having complex relations with Russia, but these relations are important for Ankara. However, there are certainly more idealistic Ukrainians who believe that both the West and Turkey should side with Ukraine with no additional clauses and fight against Russia. However, international politics is a little bit complicated for simple decisions like this to be carried out. So we do understand how important Turkey's support is, and no matter how close at times the Turkish-Russian relations may be, but the significance of Turkey's policy in the Black Sea, especially in the Black Sea region, is very important. And I'm not so much following the grain issue, but I do understand that it is not only about grain. It is mostly about trust, which is absent. And this is about the future, because, well, this year's harvest is maybe gone soon and the problem will disappear. But the question is what the situation will look like the next year, whether Ukraine will have its territories, which have been producing large part of grains, still occupied by Russia by the next year. Will Ukraine be cut off its seaports? And it may very well be the case that in the next year this problem will just not arise, because Ukraine will lose a significant part of its agricultural potential because of the occupation. So I think that once again the war is putting a question mark over a lot of issues.
Thank you very much, Mykola. Pavel, maybe to you I would have a slightly different question, since you're working for a peace research institute, and I mean, so do I partly. And what I feel and what we are feeling in this field is that it's very, very much biased on either how to explain what happened now with European security. In essence, it's looking for like who is to blame. And I have the tendency, and I feel like some are saying it was NATO more or less responsible for everything. Others are saying it's just Russia is aggressive in nature. And then you have like this theory, I don't know, about liberalism against authoritarianism and all those issues. And my question would be for you, I mean, how do you tackle these also when it comes to in the academic discourse? Because I feel it's very, very difficult also in Central and Western Europe. It's very difficult if you try to balance between war and conflict, that people are saying to you, oh, but then you're like pro-Putin, and you're very, very easy get into one corner, and people try to defend themselves very quickly by actually trying to explain how multifaceted, how multi-layered the conflict in general is. So how would you maybe describe the academic discourse when it comes to this, as you also mentioned, the first large-scale war on European soil since the terrible Balkan wars in the 90s, which we should never forget about as well, of course.
Yes. All right. Let me put my two topics on the grain issue. I think the question about provoking Russia is very much a moving target. It was one set of concern about not provoking Russia at the start of the war, at the middle of the war. It was different set of concern. Now it's entirely third. But each time there is a strong move, Russia is backing off. And Russia many times said that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is unacceptable when it began. Moscow backed off. Now it is backing off on the issue of kind of Kaliningrad and control of the kind of limited transit to Kaliningrad. It has backed off from Kyiv after all. So I think a strong stance from NATO on that thing, that either it is a kind of NATO convoy or it is a Turkish initiative. And I think Moscow would run to embrace a Turkish initiative instead of US freedom of navigation operation, if there is a kind of real threat of that. So I don't think it's about provoking Russia. And on your question about kind of discussions about how this war came about, how this disaster really happened, it is a very complex question, and it's not really about who is to blame. It's about our failure of imagination, about failure of NATO deterrence. There are many things involved here. My take is that overall, what determined that inevitability of the war is a mutation of Putin's regime. How it step by step turned away from any kind of democratic transition into an authoritarian restoration, and how Ukraine therefore became a threat to that regime, not because of its ties with NATO, but because of its attempts to build democracy. And I think this question is crucial. The Ukrainian commitment to building a free society was an unacceptable challenge for Putin's authoritarianism. It could not have been resolved differently unless the West would have taken far stronger stance, and it was ready to do because nobody really was could have imagined that Putin would commit a crime of this scale, a miscalculation of this sort, a kind of a blunder of these heroic proportions. And I don't think it's worth revisiting the old discussion whether NATO enlargement was a good thing, was a good idea or not. It is kind of water under many bridges. What is essential now is really to go for a combination of what is the immediate goal in supporting Ukraine, what is the secondary goal of how to deal with the defeated Russia.
Thank you so much. I think there is no more question here. So we did have like 1 hour full. So we can already close, I would suggest. I mean, I would always, of course, have many more questions, but I think it's time also then to have a break. Let me thank you so much for your participation. Let me thank to all our cooperation partners. I'm very, very happy that we managed to keep these Odesa talks, I mean, a slightly different format as we had it earlier, which was in presence, at least alive. And this is also part of a very important part when it comes also to how to support Ukraine in general. It's also, please, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it publicly. And then in order to see what a win or whatever that can actually mean in order for Ukraine to move forward. Thank you very much. It was for me very interesting, different perspectives, especially also the relations with Turkey, which are not so much on the focus in Central Europe, I must say. And I think it is a very important partner on the one hand, a very complicated partner very often. And thank you very much for all your contributions. I wish you a very nice evening, and thanks a lot to Dimitrios Triantafylou, who unfortunately is sick today as well, who has been very, very active in putting this all together. And thank you. Enjoy your evening.